For centuries, the Imperium of Sol had endured, ruling with iron-fisted stability over countless worlds. But stagnation, corruption, and centuries of bureaucratic decay had left it vulnerable. Once glorious fleets rusted in their berths. The nobility squabbled over planetary scraps while entire sectors fell into anarchy. The once revered high ecclesiarchy of the stellar faith, the spiritual backbone of humanity, had fractured, leaving a void in the soul of the Imperium. Then came Saint Magnus the Unyielding. Born in the forge world of Varkos IX, Magnus was the son of a lowly factory priest who tended the sacred machines of the Mechanist order. Unlike the soft clergy of the ecclesiarchy, Magnus was forged in suffering, raised in the glow of plasma furnaces, surviving the brutal toil of industrial labor and endless warfare against raiders. He rose through the ranks of the warrior priesthood, and with every battle his legend grew. On the day of revelation, it was said that Magnus received a vision from the celestial pantheon, deities worshipped by humanity's faithful. He was commanded to lead a great crusade, not only to restore the Imperium, but to forge it into something greater. The world of Varkos IX erupted in religious fervor, and under Magnus a new order was born, the Iron Saints. No longer merely priests, the Iron Saints were warrior zealots, clad in sacred armor grafted to their own flesh. They embraced cybernetic enhancement not as mere tools, but as divine gifts, believing that each augmentation brought them closer to godhood. With their faith as their shield and steel as their flesh, they set out to cleanse the galaxy of corruption, heresy, and weakness. Their target? The ecclesiarchy that had abandoned its people, and the machine-worshipping technocrats who sought to replace faith with cold logic. Thus began the Iron Saints' Crusade. Part 1. The March of the Saints. At first, none took them seriously. The Imperium had seen countless warlords rise and fall, yet the Iron Saints did not behave like mere rebels. They did not seek conquest, they sought purification. Their armies did not merely kill, they converted. Entire planetary garrisons fell before them, not by the sword alone, but by the word of Magnus himself. He spoke not as a tyrant, but as a prophet, declaring, "Magnus, mankind's destiny is not in the hands of decadent nobles or mindless machines, but in the will of those strong enough to forge their own salvation." His followers grew exponentially. On each world, the Iron Saints offered a choice. Join the crusade and be reforged. Resist and be purified by fire. The corrupted aristocracy resisted. The cybernetic technocrats of the Mechanist order declared him a heretic, an enemy of logic and progress. The ecclesiarchy branded him a false prophet. It did not matter. One by one, the forged temples of the saints grew, converting entire planetary populations into zealots. Cybernetic enhancements became sacred rites. The strongest warriors underwent the rite of ascension, in which their flesh was stripped away and replaced with divine metal, making them unkillable, immortal beings of faith and steel. The crusade burned across the stars. Magnus had become more than a man, he had become a living god. The war for the soul of humanity. The Imperium panicked. For the first time in centuries, the ruling powers realized they were facing an enemy that could not be bribed, outmaneuvered, or intimidated. The Iron Saints were not mere rebels, they were an ideological wildfire. Desperation led to an unprecedented grand alliance. The noble houses gathered their private armies, seeking to crush the uprising before it destabilized their iron grip over humanity's future. The Mechanist order unleashed their greatest war machines, declaring that the Iron Saints were a threat to rational civilization and technological purity. The ecclesiarchy, though weakened, issued a holy war against Magnus, branding him a false prophet and a blasphemer against the true faith. The war that followed was cataclysmic. Entire planets were razed. Cities became battlefields turned into holy shrines of blood and metal. The the Iron Saints, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, held firm. Every saint that fell was rebuilt, reforged, stronger than before. No battle broke their will. No siege made them yield. The fleets of the Crusade met the combined might of the Imperium above countless war-torn worlds. Battle hymns echoed across the void as Iron Saints' dreadnoughts engaged the Imperial Armada. Where the Imperium relied on sheer firepower, the Saints fought with relentless zeal, boarding enemy ships, converting crews and turning vessels once sent to destroy them into holy instruments of war. The Imperium began to fracture from within. As battles raged, entire regiments defected, swearing loyalty to the Crusade, their commanders whispering, "Our leaders have failed us, but the Saints offer purpose." The once unstoppable imperial war machine began to rust from within. But Magnus knew that total war was unsustainable. To truly win, he had to strike at the heart of the enemy. Thus began the march to Sol. Part 3. The Siege of Terra Prime. The Iron Saints reached Terra Prime, the Imperium's throne world, in less than a decade, a feat no enemy had ever accomplished. The entire weight of the Imperium awaited them. The final battle would decide the fate of mankind. The war for Terra Prime did not begin with orbital bombardments or grand invasions. It began with whispers, with fear, with the realization that the enemy was not at the gates but already within the walls. The nobility, once so sure of their absolute dominion, found their power crumbling as entire legions refused to fight. The very people they had ruled now saw them as weak relics of a dying age. The Eternal Fortress, the Imperium's last bastion, was thought impenetrable. Its walls were constructed of nano-reinforced adamantine, its garrisons filled with the most advanced cybernetic warriors ever created by the Mechanist Order. Within its halls, the last remnants of the ecclesiarchy prepared their final prayers, believing that their divine right to rule would see them through. They were wrong. The Iron Saints did not breach the Eternal Fortress. They walked through its gates. For within its walls, half the defenders had already converted. The Crusade had done its work long before the siege ever began. The very fabric of the Imperium's power had been undermined by its own people, who had been reforged in faith and steel long before Magnus arrived. The nobility, once untouchable, were left defenseless, abandoned, powerless. The ruling class had expected execution, but Magnus did not see them as worthy of such a death. Instead, they were stripped of all status, cast out into the wastelands of their own making. Some attempted to fight, only to be crushed beneath the weight of their own failed empire. Others fled, vanishing into obscurity, their names erased from history. Their worlds were not conquered, they were reborn under the new order. The ecclesiarchy, fractured and leaderless, was restructured from within. The false prophets were purged, and those who had cowered behind false scripture were forced to kneel before the very faith they had once wielded as a weapon. The Mechanists, humbled by their defeat, were given an ultimatum: serve the new order or be erased. And as Magnus stood over the ruins of the old Imperium, he did not declare himself emperor. Instead, he turned to the stars and declared the Crusade would never end. The Eternal March. Even after the fall of Terra Prime, the Iron Saints did not stop. The old Imperium had been purged, but the galaxy was vast, and corruption was never truly gone. The Crusade continues, but it has evolved. No longer simply a war against tyrants, it has become an ongoing reforging of humanity itself. New worlds join the fold, their people willingly embracing the path of faith and steel. The weak and the lost find purpose, not as mere citizens, but as warrior disciples of the eternal cause. Magnus, now more machine than man, no longer walks among his followers as he once did. His mortal frame, ravaged by battle and reforged beyond recognition, is now interred within the celestial throne, his mind linked to the vast neural network of the Crusade. Through him the Iron Saints receive guidance, their every battle waged with his eternal will driving them forward. The greatest warriors among them, those who have surpassed their mortality and proven themselves as paragons of faith and combat, ascend to become eternal saints, immortal warlords who lead entire crusading legions across the void. Each world they liberate becomes another bastion of their growing domain, an empire not of oppression but of discipline, purpose, and divine will. But not all accept the rule of the Iron Saints. There are still remnants of the old Imperium hiding in the outer reaches, plotting their revenge. There are rogue mechanists who seek to sever faith from flesh and restore the cold logic of machine dominion. There are false prophets who twist the Crusade's message for their own gain. And beyond the borders of known space, alien empires watch and wait, unsure whether the Crusade is a force of salvation or a storm that will one day consume all. Thus, the war never ends. Not because the Saints crave conquest, but because the galaxy is vast, and there will always be those who stand against the reforging of mankind. To this day, across the stars, one phrase echoes in the cold void: only the strong can forge salvation.